Welcome back, everybody. And congratulations for coming back, because this is the best session of the day. We've got a wonderful panel. You've had a long day. But now we're really going to get down to hard tacks. My name's Quentin Peel, and I'm a journalist for most of my life, but I now sit at that rather worthy think tank in London called Chatham House. But I will make a little confession to you. I don't sit there very often, because for the last year and a half, I have been fighting to stop Brexit. And I still believe it can be done. My first message. I will now go back into behaving properly. We're going to be discussing the economy and countering corruption. I just want to give a little bit of an introduction before I introduce the panel and let them go. Because today, throughout the day, we've talked about universal values and human rights, and also about the disaffection of voters with the democratic process. Norbert Lammert, at lunchtime, or just before lunch, referred to Francis Fukuyama and his thesis about the end of history and how wrong he was. Because we have not seen either a triumph of liberal democracy or the final triumph of the market economy. In fact, the very values that we thought were embedded, if you like, in the end of history are being questioned very much again. And therefore what we're seeing, certainly in Western Europe and in America, but not just in Brazil, in the Philippines, the rise of populist parties offering very simple solutions. Stop immigration, raise national barriers, trade protection, America first. Everything that we actually thought we were opening up the world against, that this was not the way forward. So what's gone wrong? And I would argue just this. There's been an extraordinary combination of factors in the last 40 years raising the entire level of insecurity. Within that was the end of the Cold War, because the Cold War, for all its dreadfulness and staleness and dullness, was sort of safe. We knew where we were. We were in our ideological silos. And suddenly, with the end of the Cold War, everything was back in question again. Borders were back in question. Old ethnic rivalries, old religious rivalries. And not just that, but the economic crisis that clearly occurred after that. Climate change in the background all the time. We were discussing it in the last panel. The technological revolution and the geopolitical upheaval, with the huge shift in power going on from the West to the East, the rise of China, and mass migration all at the same time. Now, with all of those things happening on the economic front, we've also seen deeply destabilizing processes, which I am convinced, and I hope my panel will disagree with some of my thesis, but I'm convinced that actually these crises too have been very much part of the alienation of ordinary voters and ordinary people from, if you like, the political process. Start with the collapse of the Soviet Union and the rise of robber capitalism. I mean, the dramatic thing about the opening of the former Soviet economy was that actually what it liberated was the most raw and challenging form of capitalism, not entrepreneurial capitalism, but robber capitalism, the rise of the oligarchs, and with it, massive corruption. So Russia's arguably seen the greatest outflow of capital of any country in the last 50 years, 100 years or more, laundered through the financial centers of the Western economy, through Europe, through America, London and Vienna, Cyprus and the British Virgin Islands. But in the West, we've had another crisis, a huge financial crisis. And what was behind it? An explosion of actually financial engineering, a switch in enormous amounts of capital from the manufacturing economy, the productive economy, into the financial economy. Far more than was really needed to get the manufacturing system, the really profitable. So investment in derivatives, in hyper trading, you name it, all coming to a head and causing the great financial crisis of 2007, 2008. It all came to head then. And what it coincided with was also a renewed surge in migration. And I think those two things together, more than anything else, are behind the disaffection of ordinary voters. And the backlash we've seen. We avoided the backlash at first. I mean, I think just when Jacek became finance minister of Poland, and I will introduce you properly, Jacek, in a minute, we actually prevented that 2007 crisis tipping into the Great Depression of the 1930s. Because everybody feared we were going to go into protectionism and national barriers being raised. And at first it didn't happen. But what's really happened is that actually has happened 10 years later. So have we solved the problem? And I think that's part of what I want to try and answer today. Have we solved the problem? Do we have answers? Or is it capable of happening again? Because what happened then? Most of the banks were bailed out, often with taxpayers' money, and very few bankers went to jail. Yet the taxpayers have suffered years of austerity, cuts in public spending, and stagnating incomes as a result. So no wonder there's been a political backlash. So was it actually the economy, and was it us that got it wrong? And have we done enough to prevent it happening again? How on earth can we root out the corruption that has now become endemic, I would argue, not just in the former Soviet space, but in China and in the Western economy? It's a huge challenge, and it's a challenge, I think, to precisely the sort of audience that we are here today. It's a challenge to civil society, how we can control it and cope with it. So that's also the second part of the answer I want to look at. Have we done enough to prevent this explosion of financial speculation undermining the economy again? And have we done anything like enough to try and control corruption? Now let me introduce the panel to you. On my immediate left, Fredrik Erixon is director and co-founder of the European Centre for International Political Economy in Brussels, one of the premier think tanks and particularly focused on trade and global commercial policy. Fredrik, I will ask to open and probably disagree with lots of what I've said. Then I'm going to turn to Elena Panfilova, who I think many of you will already know well. She's the chair of Transparency International Russia and on the board of the Transparency International Board. Is it now in Berlin or in London, the Transparency International Board? Yeah, but founded here in Berlin by the wonderful Peter Eigen. And Elena has done probably more to explain, investigate, and counter the corruption that is throughout that post-Soviet world. And last, but by no means least, I'm going to turn to Jacek Rostowski, who was Finance Minister of Poland from 2007 to 2013 when he became Deputy Prime Minister, and I believe that makes him the longest-serving Finance Minister in the history of Poland. Poland has come and gone, but Finance Ministers, and he will, I think, take the big overview too. But I want to turn to you first, Fredrik, to tell us the degree to which you think the economy, the crash, has been correctly analysed, Have we done enough to prevent it coming again? And to what degree do you think that really has been part of the alienation that we've seen of ordinary voters?
Thank you very much, Quentin, and also thank you again to inviting me here. Even this year, I was here last year for the fantastic celebration. I'm very glad to be back here in Berlin again to, in this perfect style of these events, talk about things where you're not really sure what the answers to the questions are, and indeed you're not even sure what you're going to talk about when you well, what the questions are when you accept an invitation to come here. But I think that's exactly the type of events that are meaningful and interesting, because it's going to lead to a discussion that is going to take us forward. So, I mean, starting with one of your questions, Quentin. So I heard this the other day. Someone was explaining Italian politics to me and what's happened in Italy over the past year or so, with the election in the spring, leading to a grand victory or grand increase in the support for the Five Star Movement, and of course for the Northern League, or the League. And someone was saying, sort of, you can look at this in two ways. This is the sort of the typical response to the crises that we've had over the past years, or indeed, this is the response to Chancellor Angela Merkel. You have, in one way, the Five Star Movement, which is more of sort of a center-left or leftist type of populist movement, responding to austerity, the politics of the crisis that, at least according to some, forced down cuts in public expenditures and increases in taxes on poor Italian voters. And then you had the other crisis, the migration crisis, which then provided a boost for Matteo Salvini, the current Deputy Prime Minister and Justice Minister in Italy, who, of course, campaigned on a very sort of nativist, nationalist worldview, where not just confronted with the horrors of the migration crisis in the Mediterranean part and on Sicily, but also taking a far broader view of European openness and putting a challenge to Europe, which is about closing its borders and becoming far more restrictive about the way it integrates with the rest of the world, especially, of course, on migration. So in that sense, it's easy to see sort of how crises in the past, even if we don't subscribe to this particular view of Italian politics, it's easy to see how crises in the past at least have provided triggers for elections in different countries. But I don't think that there is sort of a general theory about the rise of populism or the sort of growing level of anger among voters. I think sort of like Tolstoy, that all unhappy families are unhappy in their own ways, and we can find different explanations to what's going on in Italy, to what happened in America when they elected Trump, or what happened in Britain when they voted in a referendum to leave the European Union, or indeed what's behind sort of the support for the Sweden Democrats in my mother country, Sweden, or similar type of countries, similar type of parties in other countries. There is this view out there, sort of, that dissatisfaction among voters has been driven by rising levels of income inequalities, indeed even wealth inequalities. That income stagnation over a pretty long time has sort of finally pushed voters in order to protest in a more broader way against the type of economy that we had in the past. I mean, I think there is some truth in that. I think we can certainly sort of point to examples and point to countries where income stagnation or sort of growing level of dissatisfaction about what you get out from work has been one element in driving voters to be more angry about the establishment, to be angry about what is going on in the economy. But I think if we take sort of in the spirit of trying to find some economic explanation to all this anger and to the drive among voters to go for parties that represent sort of something completely different than what establishment parties have done in the past. I think we have to move away from the more sort of macro aggregate levels of income development, have to more understand what's been sort of going on in the economy and larger perceptions about how money is being raised, what is earned rewards, what are unearned rewards in the economy. Do sort of people feel that they are putting in a lot of effort into work, but not getting sort of enough back at the same time as they can see other people in the companies, especially at the top, earning enormous amounts of money for work that may not be as hard as what they produce. So if we begin to sort of explore that type of economics explanation behind the crisis, I think I'd like sort of to start by looking at what type of economy that we've had since the 1970s onwards. An economy that in many ways have been generating prosperity, especially through increasing levels of trade and investment across borders. Growing role of multinationals that initially at least provided a very strong effect on domestic economies when they stepped into new markets and helped to bring up levels of competition in markets that tended to have been pretty saturated for quite some time. We had a lot of more new factors of production coming into the economy. A lot more debt, a lot more capital went into the economy. And this is certainly something which has grown over the past 25 years. And now, so we have been in a situation for quite some time where the cost of capital has virtually been zero for companies and others that have the ability to easily lend money on capital markets for different purposes. We have grown accustomed to a type of mentality that the easiest way for you to improve your material conditions right now is probably going to be to take up more loans. You're going to use sort of the value of your property in order to increase your mortgage, in order to buy a new car, buy a new flat screen TV or whatever. And I think there has been sort of a psychological effect coming from a long period of cheap capital where for a lot of people the easiest way to improve your material standard has been to raise your debt. And coming back to the question you raised, Quentin, sort of about the factors behind the crisis and whether we are in control about the factors that typically lead to financial crises, my answer would be no. And I think we have to start with looking sort of at credit growth in the economy. I mean, that's usually where crises start. Then we can sort of go in to look at financial engineering and many other things, but you can't financially engineer much if there is no capital out there, no credit out there which grows. And we have yet again been in a period where credit growth in many countries have been at very, very high levels. So my take here would be sort of that we've had a type of economy where we have connected economies to each other, in that way grown our prosperity, getting cheaper access to products, more capital being put on the market, which had also led households and companies to have sort of a pretty easy type of life, in the sense that you didn't need to invest as much, or you didn't need to innovate as much in order to make your way in the world. If you could sort of plow the capital markets and understand how you as a multinational could operate the global market, you were pretty much in a safe position. You could earn quite a lot of money. But I think there's something which went missing in that period that we also can express in perhaps more philosophical terms, and especially sort of if you talk about it in the context of agency and the perceptions of yourself, if you can improve your own material circumstances by putting more effort into what you're doing. And that effort could be sort of you work harder, or you work smarter, or you educate yourself, or you find other ways that will help you over a period of time sort of to raise your material conditions, perhaps also give you a better life more generally. And I think sort of there is a development where we've been shrinking the space for agency and for the individual to be sort of a whole individual in the economy, being sort of seen as a complete individual, being able to display all their individual varieties and complexities in the way that we operate the economy. And I'd like to point to just a couple of factors where I think this is happening. If there's something which has been growing very fast over the past 30, 40 years, it is organizational bureaucracy. That we have sort of yet again see sort of the rebirth of what in the 1950s was called the organization man. Sloan Wilson wrote this book about the man in the gray flannel suit who was sort of the typical representative of American capitalism back then, a person with a knack for organization and hierarchy, but that weren't particularly creative or talented in order to create new stuff or create new things. That lived in a spirit of managerialism where we lay down rules and bureaucratic norms for virtually everything, and everyone was going to be organized in a way that was mapped organizationally already from the start. Boston Consulting Group has something called the Index of Corporate Complexity, where they look at how bureaucracy inside corporations work, and they have estimated that we have seen a compounded growth rate of 7% of growth of bureaucracy in corporations since the 1970s. So growth of around 7% every year in the type of sort of bureaucratic managerialism protocols that manage the way people are going to behave inside corporations. And I think there's there's few things that can be as soul destroying as working inside bureaucracies, where sort of your own aspirations, abilities, imaginations, your own willingness to do things that are outside the boundaries of the bureaucratic map simply isn't possible, where you are almost living in a Kafkaesque type of environment where sort of you go from meeting to meeting to meeting to meeting, but you never sort of produce anything and you never have a chance to actually achieve anything beyond the time that you waste just following what the bureaucratic protocol is going to say. And sort of, I mean, this is always sort of the type of behavior that you would associate with the government, but this has really been growing fast in the corporate capitalist world over the past couple of decades, and sort of led to type of organizations which I think just sort of shrink the space for individuals to be who they are and to behave in manners that allows people to see not just one part of you, the bureaucratic you, but many other parts of you as well. This leads me to my second point, which is about work dissatisfaction. There is this quote from Hannah Arendt in his book, The Human Condition, where she goes through sort of political philosophy and try to understand what significance that political thinkers usually put on the type of aspirations and imaginations you have for what you produce and what you do. And she says, if you listen to John Locke, he thinks that work is the source of your property. That is basic theory. Adam Smith thought that work is, well, basically the wealth of nations. That's how you create wealth. And Karl Marx thought it was basically the essence of man. Hannah Arendt lays out a completely different take on not on work, but on labor and what you try to achieve by your non-material ambitions that goes into what you do and what type of imaginations and ambitions that you can get out from it. Now, if you look at different surveys and academic research being done at how people perceive their ability to actually get something out from their work, is a pretty horrible perspective. Gallup, for instance, suggests that half of Europeans are disengaged, half of European workers are disengaged from their work, and around 1/5 of them are actively disengaged, which means that they're actually trying to destroy what they do and what the organization do. They're working deliberately against the purpose of the organization where they are. Another study taking sort of that Hannah Arendt perspective on your own psychology and how you associate your psychological ambitions with your work, which suggests that in Europe there's only 1 out of 7 workers that are psychologically committed to the work that they have. And I think this is something, and I can sort of give you lots of other examples that have basically pointing to the same conclusions, which is that we see a growing disengagement, a growing gap between what people have in terms of aspirations for what they produce and what they want that to represent, and what they actually are offered to do at work. Last point is about another issue where I think we have gradually been shrinking the space for individuals, and that concerns entrepreneurship. One element of it is that we have, over the past 40 years, seen sort of growing concentration and less contestable competition in many markets as a consequence of large companies getting larger, as a consequence of a lot of big companies in the world merging with other big companies in the world, and sort of gradually making it more and more difficult to step into these markets for others and compete in a way which is actually the type of competition which helps to drive innovation forward and prices down. But we've seen sort of from the viewpoint of entrepreneurship almost across the Western world. The OECD did a study a few years ago suggesting that between 2000 and 2014 there was only 2 OECD countries where entrepreneurship had grown, and that was Israel and Sweden. In all other countries, you have seen falling rates of entrepreneurship in whatever way you want to measure it. When we look at how many companies that are being created every year, how many companies that are stepping out of markets either because they are outcompeted, they go bankrupt, or the entrepreneurs that run the company have decided not to continue. These firms' sort of entry and exit levels has been dropping across the Western world for quite some time. They've been going up in many of the countries that were liberated in the late 1980s and the early 1990s, but even there we begin to see that the trend is going in a reverse direction as well. The maturity of firms, or mature firms, are getting a larger share of the market in the past. The average age of corporation is getting older and older, and we see among people, and especially young people, a greater fear of failure, which leads to falling rates of entrepreneurship and sort of less interest in order to try to create something new, because they are fear of the failure that may come on the heels of an entrepreneurial idea that you want to test. Gradually, sort of these type of factors will begin to eat themselves into our macro figures. They will start to affect our productivity rates, our growth rates, and our ability in societies to have economies that can provide for not just good incomes, but good material conditions sort of across the board. And gradually, I think it also sort of creates perceptions about the economy and what the economy represents, which I think are unfortunate. And they are unfortunate because they help to sort of reinforce this development, this noxious development that I've been trying to portray here, which is that we gradually have been shrinking the space for the individual to be an individual in the economy. And ultimately, economic behavior as well as political behavior, we can sort of analyze it at a macro level, but in essence, it is about what individuals decide to do. It is about agency and the ability of every individual to understand that it's in their power to create the type of life, the working life or the type of economic life they have. And if people feel that there is a huge gap between those aspirations and reality, then I think we get a type of economy which is gradually just going to make us not necessarily poorer, but much unhappier.
Thank you very much, Fredrik. It's a fairly depressing view of what I think you call grey capitalism, of sort of capitalism stifling on its own bureaucracy, and also the idea that actually people are not enjoying the work they do. I mean, I confess that after 40 years as a journalist, I still used to pinch myself and saying, my God, I'm enjoying myself so much, and they pay me, which was always rather surprising. But it sort of reminds me of a sort of capitalist turnaround of that the famous old Soviet slogan, we pretend to work and the state pretends to pay us. Now it's maybe we pretend to work and the bureaucratic capitalist pretends to pay us. But I'm not sure that that's enough of an explanation for me, partly because surely there are those startups out there and everything else that, and new technology is a more disruptive to the whole process. But maybe that's why the defensiveness is growing. But we'll come back to that. I want to come to Elena and actually look at where the cancer of corruption then fits into this picture of a capitalist system that is actually almost becoming sclerotic in Fredrik's view. But we have out there a great black market world which is out of control, isn't it? Shall I put this one over to you?
Thanks much, Quentin, and thanks much, Lena and Yura, for inviting me, and thanks, wonderful Inna, for putting me in the panel finally about economy, not only about civil society and more general things where I'm expected to deliver. And I'm sorry for speaking English because I want especially our Western participants to understand as clear as I want it to be understood everything what I'm going to say. Because indeed, when we talk about corruption in terms of economy, and we try to pretend that corruption is some symptom of dysfunctioning states, ugly states. Yeah, indeed, Russian corruption is huge, and we know a lot of facts about it. Ukrainian corruption is huge, and we know a lot of facts about it. Azeri corruption is huge, we know a lot of facts about it. And we can discuss it like for how many, like 3 days, 4 days, 5 days, and nothing will be like really changing while we are discussing that. But what is important to understand that it's a global process, and it has much to do with economy and labor market. Because when you come over to the southern Portugal, they say there, we hate corruption, but we like Angolan corrupt officials who brought a lot of money to save our real estate market and create a lot of jobs. When you come to London, you hear that we hate corruption, we are pro-democracy, we love democracy, we will support any possible civil society, but thank you for bringing your dirty money to our city because you saved our real estate market and created a lot of jobs. And people enjoy their labor there because it's cozy. And you see, we are living in a very Kafkian world where, from one hand, all governments, Eastern, Western, they adopt hundreds of anti-corruption, transparency, anti-money laundering conventions. From other hand, they show real tolerance toward, real corruption. They accept dirty money in their countries because this money are helping them to deal with the crisis of 2008, 2012, before and after. This money are coming from our countries and saving global capitalist economy. And it seems like nobody really wants to do anything about it. Corruption evolved tremendously since early 90s. It's not state capture as Danny Kaufman and Joel Hellman put it in 1998, right? Corrupt people are capturing the state inside one country. What is happening in 2018 is international state capture. National corrupt elites are capturing international market through unworking anti-money laundering institutions and unworking anti-corruption conventions. Because otherwise it's impossible to explain that the son of Gabonese president is found guilty in corruption and buying a lot of luxury property in France, in Paris, and it's arrested and confiscated, and he's got a diplomatic immunity from criminal punishment, and it's given by international organizations and national governments, meaning that people want it to stay somehow. Otherwise, why? I mean, there is no explanation otherwise. And what is happening afterwards, that we are talking about like economic crisis, corruption crisis, migration crisis, populism crisis, but there is always some real cause behind that crisis. Why are people leaving their countries and migrating to cause migration crisis? Because there is kind of a poverty, but also corruption. Because those governments in African countries, in other Asian countries, they're stealing money, corruption is flourishing, and nobody really do anything about it. And when there is a tradition to name the corrupt countries in our conferences, like from our post-Soviet region, but we can add half of the African countries, Indonesia, many other countries, and of course, influx of new migrants are caused by corruption, which is fed by inability, absolute stagnation of international attempts to stop that national corruption from feeding the international market. So I would argue that economy doesn't work separately from democratic institutions. Economy doesn't work separately from institutional response of concrete governments. And if you have problem with institutional response to concrete challenges such as corruption, such as laundered money flooding in the countries. And they are flooding now in an evolved ways. I mean, corrupt officials are everything, but they are not stupid. They totally understood that there are tools right now, especially after Panama Papers, Paradise Papers, a lot of investigations. They know that we know how to find their accounts. They know how to find their trusts, how to find their funds. What they do now, they do invest in real economy, in industries, in infrastructure, real estate, meaning that they do create new working spaces. They do create growth of the certain economies, but the money with which it is being made are still dirty and laundered, meaning that you always can find organized crime somewhere near that money. It's never safe to have laundered investment in your country because of their region of laundered money. Because next day, or next year or next decade, the organized crime will come and claim that money in those labor places, and everything will be lost. And as a result, I would argue that the populist crisis about which Quentin just said, it partially is caused by the fact that citizens of Western, Eastern countries, they gradually develop this civic and economic cynicism, because they see everything. They do see that their governments, with one hand, do one thing, with other hand, they do absolutely opposite thing. They are not stupid. It's impossible to hide it. As one parliamentarian from one country said that, Elena, what do you want? Somebody's dirty money is somebody's other's jobs and happy voters. And yeah, and then you expect people to vote with their hearts, with their values and souls, for the people who are trading everything for, values, souls, for to be elected. And then, of course, we can see that influx of dirty money, for whatever reason, are not being treated as seriously as serious crisis for Western economies and democracies as, say, intervention with elections. Whereas, in my opinion, it's much more dangerous because investment with dirty money stays longer than the manipulation with one concrete elections. But money has this attraction toward the people who are in power. And I do believe that this concept and this debate, which we started with actually Georgy Satarov and same Danny Kaufman many, many years ago, like corruption, is it a symptom of problems with economy and democracy or the cause? I do believe that it's drifting deeper and deeper towards the cause, because corruption starts to reproduce itself. It used to be symptom of unworking institutions, unexisting laws, weak economic structures. Right now we see corrupt governments, corrupt international institutions adopting laws to reproduce corruption. They adopt laws which will produce more and more corruption. They appoint people who shouldn't be appointed. And I have to say that it's not only Eastern problem. We do see that that corruption, in terms of being not always monetary thing, is quite widespread in the Western institutions either. Conflict of interest. Do we know family and friends appointed to the certain positions, and contracts are given to the companies affiliated to certain former vice ministers, vice presidents? We know one prime minister who got a job with somebody to whom he was quite close while he was a prime minister. Isn't it revolving doors? And that is non-monetary corruption. And again, citizens do see that. And we expect them not to be cynical and not to vote populistically. That is strange. That is very, very strange to expect them to be much more honest and much more value-oriented than their own politicians. And I do think that civil society has a huge, and journalists, to that matter, has a lot to do to fix that. From our part, we do our part, and we will continue discussion tomorrow. We try to find solutions. But I do believe that in the section of economy, it is important for us to understand that economic institutions accepting laundered, corrupt money, which is quite often is the only solution to save certain sectors of certain economies in certain countries, is easy but deadly way out. Thank you.
Thank you, Elena, very much. I mean, in a way, what I think you're saying is we're just the most dreadful hypocrites. Here we are preaching against corruption, but actually living with it and tolerating it. Jacek, do you think... Yes. Jacek, is that fair? Are we terrible hypocrites? Have you got a microphone down there?
Yeah, I'm sure that we're hypocrites, and I'm sure we're snobs, and it's human to be hypocritical. The question is, what is the order of magnitude of the hypocrisy and of the corruption and of things like that? And I think it's important if we're, and the thing that interests me about this is the rise of populism and how it's going to evolve. And on this, I think I disagree very, very strongly with what's just been said, both by you and by Quentin.
And I'll start this. We're going to have trouble.
I'll start with the corruption. I totally disagree with the idea that populism is the result of voters seeing corruption among politicians and then, in some sense, voting against it. Now, you know, your view may be a little more subtle, maybe much more subtle than that, but that was part of what you were saying. The idea that you vote against a corrupt Hillary Clinton by voting for a clean Donald Trump seems to me so absurd as not to require comment. And I think, but if we think about that for a moment, that there's a, you know, but that's, some people did that, right? Why did they do that? Nobody in their right minds could believe that Hillary Clinton is more corrupt than Donald Trump. And I'll come back to that in a minute, because it's a story which I think we've already got some, we've got some information about why voters vote for populists, which voters vote for populists, why voters vote for populists, and I'll come back to that in a minute. Actually, it'll turn out there's a little bit of truth in what you said, but maybe not quite the way some people may have taken it. The second one is, I also don't believe that populism is caused by inequality, by the rise of inequality. In other words, I think there are basically no excuses for voting populist. And we shouldn't be nice, liberal, social democrats who say, oh, you poor thing, you've had a hard life, that's why you're voting populist. No, basically people vote populist because they are bad and angry. And I'll come back. I will come back. Well, I never particularly liked Hillary Clinton, but I never understood people's allergy to her. And I'm quite happy to say that. And I'll by the way, I'll come on to saying that something which I'm deeply convinced is that there's a growing part of the electorate which feels the same way and thinks the same way as what I've just said. But I'll come back to that in a second. So let me start off with the inequality, and then I'll come back to the corruption. With the inequality, we just had a very important study by the US Congressional Budget Office, which actually shows that it's not true that median incomes haven't risen since 1980. They've risen by about between 30 and 50% since 1980. They've risen a lot less than the top 1%. They've risen significantly less than the top 10%, but it's not true that they have not risen. I spent 45 minutes looking for the report. I haven't been able to, because of the, well, partly I'll blame it on the internet, but also my own filing system. I wasn't able to find it, but this came out about 2 weeks ago, and I find it very convincing. For those who think that median incomes have not risen since 1980, I suggest they watch any randomly selected film from that period and compare it to the way people live now. So if it's not inequality and also not corruption, well, where does the populism come from? I think Quentin got it absolutely right when he said in his introduction that part of it is the disappearance of the old polarization we used to have between left and right, and particularly between what used to be called centre-left, but wasn't very centre, the socialist parties that we used to have, and the conservative or Christian democratic parties. That difference has effectively, after the fall of communism, just disappeared. But what I would suggest is that it's this period of a lack of polarization that we had from about 1990 to about 2010, 2015, let's say. That was the exception. In politics, in democratic politics, it's normal for there to be a high level of polarization. It's normal for there to be very powerful extremist parties which propose that money and property should be taken away from bad people and given to good people, which is the way Nigel Farage calls his voters. If you go back to 1950, the Italian Communist Party, which was a proper Stalinist party, used to get over 40% of the votes in perfectly free elections. I'm old enough to remember, as an adult, the French Communist Party getting over 30%. That's normality. The Labour Party of my youth was pretty radical, right? And you know, it was true of many other countries, though not of all of them. Now, the other thing that I think is another way that one can look at this is that if you look at the opinion polls, it's been particularly well studied in the United States, but it's also the case when we look at opinion polls from Poland. It's also I'm pretty sure the case, although I'm ready to be corrected, when we look at opinion polls from Italy and France. And that is that there is a massive gender difference between those who vote for populists and those who do not vote for populists. Men vote for populists. Educated men are slightly feminized, so they vote slightly less for populists, but men in general vote for populists and women don't vote for populists or vote against populists. Now, there's nothing new about that. In the 1930s and 1940s and 1950s, it was the men who voted for the communist parties and the women who voted for the moderate conservative parties. Women, quite sensibly, are rather attached to stability. Men have this sort of predilection for more passionate engagement in politics. More ideological. Yeah, I actually think the ideology is subsequent upon the emotions and not the other way around. Now, I mean this very seriously, and I think that's fairly clear. And so what has happened is the men have gone from the extreme left to the, well, fairly extremish right, okay? Now, the other interesting thing that is happening is, though, that doesn't have to be permanent. We can see, particularly in the United States in this last in these last congressional elections, but also in Poland in the elections for the local mayors and local authorities and so on, that there is a clear mobilization of the anti-populist electorate. A clear mobilization, and although of course anti-populist politicians are trying to encourage that, the impression one gets is that it's mostly a self-mobilization. The anti-populist electorate is mobilizing against the populist electorate. You could see that. I mean, a very good example of this was in Warsaw. You know, we always win Warsaw. Not this last election, but the previous one, we won in the second round with 360,000 votes. This time, we won in the first round with 510,000 votes. Right? We got 56% in the first round. Law and Justice got 29. We got twice as much. All the other parties that were there, I think the most that any other candidate got was 2.5%. People were, and some of the candidates, I shouldn't say this publicly, but I think some of the candidates were better than our candidate. But people ignored that because they said to themselves, there's one party that will... I hope this is Chatham House rules. No? Yes. Oh, good. So people ignored... the door is open, yes. Well, it's my risk. People just decided, you know, we are going to choose the anti-peace candidate, the anti-law and justice candidate who has the best chance of winning, and we're going to vote for him. Okay. Now... Somebody talked about, you talked about corruption feeding anger. I think there are two issues about the corruption story, and I would call this an issue of corruption perception. The problem is that, in fact, I mean, I don't deny the facts you've said, you've presented, although I have doubts about some of them. But what I'm concerned about is the link between the facts and the political reaction to them. That's what I want to talk about. So I don't actually believe that people become populist because they observe corruption. And that's for two reasons. The first one is my experience and observations show there is never enough there's never enough absence of corruption. People never consider that politicians are clean enough to be clean, all right? It can be, you know, a dinner in a restaurant can be considered unacceptable, all right? As well as stealing billions of dollars. Politically, I'm talking about the politics of this. The other thing is, as part of my political activity, I suppose, I do quite a bit of Twitter. So I see what people write. It's quite obvious to me that people think that politicians are corrupt because they don't like them, the ones they don't like, and not the other way around. It's not that they don't like them because they think they're corrupt. They think they're corrupt because they don't like them. And, you know, I have a very clear example just recently. There's an absolutely scandalous, although financially quite small, corruption scandal that has happened, just come to light in Poland, where the head of the financial supervisor demanded the small sum of 10 million euros from the owner of a bank in exchange for not expropriating him. The interesting thing, and he's already gone, and it came to light. It was taped, right? So there's no doubt about this. The interesting thing is the reaction of the law and justice electoral base. What is their reaction? Their reaction, as one sees in many things, is highly partisan. In other words, they say, well, okay, he actually wrote the amount of money he wanted on a piece of paper. Nobody's got the piece of paper. How do we know it was 10 million euros? It doesn't really matter how much it was, right? Oh, yes, of course. Yes, well, maybe he did, but what about such and such, who they think is also corrupt? So I think we have clear evidence that it's the political polarization which breeds the perception of corruption, if you like, on the other side, yes? On the opposing side. Now, that doesn't mean that corruption isn't bad, and it doesn't mean that it's always better to have less of it, right? But always better to have less corruption, I would think. Yes, always better to have less corruption. But I don't think it's the amount of the corruption which is breeding the populism. It's coming from something else. And as I said, I think it's coming from this anger. I said initially I thought the anger was on the populist side was due to men being angry, right? Being an angrier group in society, gender in society. But what I notice now is that the anger on the anti-populist side is as great as the anger on the populist side. And so something else that's interesting is also happening, right? And I think I can't say much more than that, all right? Because at this stage, you know, where is this anger coming from? You can blame Twitter. You can think of all. My own feeling is that it's probably that societies have always been have tended towards polarization. This great political moderation of the period 1990 to 2010 was an exception. 2015 was an exception. And now we've come back to that, and on top of that we have the social media, which make it easier for people to express it individually. But that's just my guess. The other thing I would say is, as far as men are concerned, particularly men without higher education, they have a particular problem because technology does seem to be making lots more jobs easier for women to do. And two final things. One piece of clear hopefulness. There's a fascinating report of exit polls in the United States. One bit is very optimistic, a big shift in working class voters from the Republicans to the Democrats, not just of women, not just educated women, also uneducated, not uneducated, that's ridiculous, without higher education, yes? I'm sorry, I use this term, but it's obviously clearly wrong, without university education. But also men without, white women without university education, about 10 percentage point shift, and about similar for white men without higher education. So that's the positive side, if you like, that after a dose of populism, there's a reaction. And maybe people dislike the populists as much as they dislike the elites before, or at least some of them do. But the disappointing one is that more than half of white working class men now believe that Mr. Trump is self-dealing and corrupt. That would seem to be encouraging. On the other hand, 2/3 of white working class men voted for the Republicans. So there's at least 16% of white working class men who think he's self-dealing and corrupt and still vote for the Republican Party. That's interesting. Thank you.
Thank you, Jacek, very much. And I want to open it up, but maybe I'd just like to go back to Elena quickly for a right of response as well. But let me put a question to you. Is there an acceptable level of corruption? I mean, I'm reminded by the sort of pork barrel politics sort of corruption, looking after your constituents and so on. My wife comes from Southern Ireland, the Republic of Ireland, and they have a constituency with about 6 members of parliament being elected. And every single election, top of the poll, is the one man who has actually been formally expelled by his political party because he was convicted of corruption. And every single time he comes top of the poll. Is there an acceptable level of corruption?
No, but that guy probably is handsome. Yeah. I mean, I don't know. People sometimes vote because of absolutely different reasons, which has nothing to do with political affiliation or corruption or whatsoever. And yeah, I want to reply. I mean, you know, like with Mr. Trump, of course, I don't think that people voted for him thinking that he's less corrupt than Hillary. But I think there have been quite a big portion of people, from what I've heard when I was in the States during the election, that for many, many people, as you said, like with not that much of education, and especially in rural parts of the country, the fact that the party who once had a leader like Eisenhower, for example, allowed to run somebody like Mr. Trump, showed that it's not anymore shameful to be shameless. And it's possible, like, there is a Russian saying, "Гуляй рванина." I mean, everything is possible now. And it's very attractive. You can a little bit still here, a little bit there, because they allow it to be like that. And this is quite an attractive general concept to vote for a certain period of time. Now we see that probably after a certain time they rethought that concept, but for some period of moment that can be attractive psychologically and socially for some part of the society. As for the a dinner can look like a dinner, but some people here know that in my practice, we had a case when it looked like a dinner, and there was a guy who only nodded his head during the dinner after he was shown a piece of paper with some investment plan, and $13 million flew to his account. In a nutshell, it's a dinner. But in fact, it is a huge corruption scheme. So basically, corruption becomes more and more sophisticated, and we don't need to be defensive about it when we talk that corruption in the West and in the East is just, it's lost universalism. Sorry to say that. It's joint problem. We need to have a dialogue. We don't need to divide roles. Who is guilty, who is not? Who brought suitcases of cash to install democracy in Russia in 90s? There have been such guys. We don't need to look for let's put in order who was guilty. It's already happened. We need to deal with the outcomes, which are far much more serious than the individual cases of corruption. They bring much more potential damaging outcomes than individual facts of corruption. This is exactly the situation when the sum is much larger than real sum of elements of corrupt cases which we know. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, Elena. Let's open it up to questions. And I'd also like to hear from the audience, perhaps, how some of you think that corruption can be dealt with much more effectively. Let's begin with you here. Let's just say who you are.
Sergei Kushman, Kyiv, Ukraine. Extremely thought-provoking discussion, and as I explained, and it is really difficult to reconcile what I've just heard, and to rephrase the famous quote is, as I understood, of all the money, at least half is corrupt, but it is difficult to tell which half, So my question is basically about the leadership of the corporate world, because we discuss in a lot of politicians, but following the crisis of 2008 and other developments, we didn't see any kind of trials of the corporate executives who are also in this kind of mode of being really responsible towards the fundamental things. And the fall of the corporate rock star Carlos Ghosn, for example, is very telling, and the slip of Elon Musk so far. And this is like a pantheon of old and new generation of like corporate, not just executives, but like new role models for the society. And the people and young generation, they take the notion of what is being sincere or down to earth or innovative or entrepreneurial from these people. They do not form the opinion from the behavior of politicians, because as a matter of fact, all politicians are hated more or less equally everywhere. So about corporate executives, their responsibility and the lessons learned. Thank you.
Okay, let me put that to Fredrik, because you looked at.
Yeah, and let me also try to sort of tie it with some of the things that Elena said, which I sort of, in order to put it sort of more in the context of the corporate world, where we're not talking about sort of outright corruption, even if the political interpretation of it can be corruption. So there was an interesting survey done in Italy a few years ago, where they asked people, so what's the best way to improve your life? Educate yourself? Is it working harder? The top answer was knowing someone with power. That was the best way, sort of, in order to make your sort of own situation to improve pretty much. I think that's a spirit which generally has festered in also Western societies, in the sense that we are claiming to be meritocratic societies that always want to run competitions on meritocratic principle, who's going to get the job, who gets the internship, etc. But in reality, it is very much different in the sense that we have sort of gradually moving sort of to a point of a connection society where you need to know people in order to make headway. It's not completely like that, but we gradually moving in that direction. When it comes to sort of markets and how markets value different things, even if it's not corruption in the sense that we're talking about resources or money that has been sort of captured in illegal ways, I think, and we know this from lots of different psychological and sociological surveys in many countries, that there is a growing disconnect with what people think is an earned reward. Sort of, you are earning this, you've done a good work in order to earn this, and what is an unearned reward. Money that has been obtained in ways where you don't think that this is a fair market price to pay for it. And this, of course, is affecting politicians. I mean, think, for instance, like someone like Tony Blair, who, after he left 10 Downing Street, has had an income in the region of £125 million. And you can ask yourself, so what on earth sort of are people paying for? I mean, what is it done in order to have an income like that? And the reality, of course, is that, well, he's been paid in order to opening political doors. He's been paid in order to provide for political connections between companies, financiers, and those with political power. And I'm not picking on him in particular, because I think someone I have great respect for, at least his political career. But we see this sort of across sort of the world, sort of that getting sort of a crony style of capitalism where you have a revolving door phenomenon between politics and business, and you sort of get employed in order to perform services that gives you as a company an advantage vis-a-vis other companies. And sort of this is not sort of competition on entrepreneurial capitalist grounds. This is another form of competition that has been evolving. Someone like Charles Gostin and what's been playing out at Renault over the past week, I think, is pretty interesting. Partly because of the ownership structure of that firm, partly because it's the size of the firm and what's doing, partly because even if the allegations aren't true, we're talking about a person who has been having an annual income in the region around 100 million euros. So it's not someone who sort of need to sort of use corporate accounts in order to improve his material conditions. But sort of the interesting point sort of is, well, this is a person, he hasn't risked anything in that job. It's not investing his own company into Renault. And why on earth are we paying in 100 million euro a year in order to perform that particular service? Is that really an earned reward in that sense? And what we know, and coming back to my final point, what we know about society is that when it comes to people like Elon Musk and others, people earning money in a way that people feel legitimate, they don't care about someone gets sort of filthy rich. They don't care about whether people are going to be so much more prosperous than others. It's what they believe to be the illegitimate way of obtaining resources, which is sort of increasingly sticking people in the eye, because it's not just about the top. You can see this consequently throughout the economy these days, that we have reward systems that are increasingly detached from what you would say sort of is a reasonable way of valuing different sort of market services.
I'd like to get back to another question. Lady in the back in green, I'd love to hear from you a bit whether you actually disagree with some of the panelists when they say people don't mind about the amount, what Fredrik's just said, but they mind about the way they got it. We had a case in London just in the last few days where the woman chief executive and owner of a very successful online betting company who gets about £230 million salary a year has just got a £24 million increase. And one of our television programs the other day, nobody was prepared to criticize her. I was appalled at this. I just thought, why don't you put the money back into your company rather than run off with it when you're already earning an enormous amount of money? But I'd like to hear from you. Anyway, lady in green.
Hi, my name is Tamara Puchovska. I'm from Croatia. I wanted to say we've been discussing today a lot about values and norms and how they're shifting. And I think that we forgot to mention that they're shifting from politics to economy, because in recent years we have an increase in impact investment, social entrepreneurship. We have in UK Open Corporates, an NGO that actually looks at transparency in corporates and in businesses. We have a lot of shift where we are now learning in marketing that value sells, that, you know, thankfully we don't have as many naked women on products. We have, you know, we believe in this and this on products. So a very important emotional and value issue has been way more active in economy and entrepreneurship than has been in politics. And I would like to hear your views on that and how that might or might not help. Secondly, I don't agree with what has been said about corruption and voting for two reasons. One is I would make a very clear difference between anti-establishment and populist voting and politics. You can have a establishment populist movement. The reason why I don't agree is because when it comes to corruption, we have to be very clear about our own privilege. For example, Iceland. The level of tolerance towards corruption in Iceland is very little. I worked, for example, in Kosovo and in Croatia and so on. In Croatia, we have a mayor who has been voted in after he sold a humanitarian aid during the war in that same city. And this is as low as you can get as a human being, I think. The reason that people vote for him is because they think, okay, this is how our world works, and he knows how to maneuver it. That's why people don't say no to corrupt politicians, because they, on some level, feel that they've made and found their way around it, so they can then help us also get a part of it. And I also think there is a big difference between, and one of the reasons why a lot of the things that we did with anti-corruption tolerance failed was because you have to have a plan B. You have to have a society where the system works and when there's trust in the system. In countries like Kosovo or Croatia, corruption is a matter of, and I'm not saying that that makes it right or ethical or legal, but it's also a way of the way that people perceive survival. It's a survival mechanism. You know somebody who knows somebody who can get your kid a job. If you had a system that worked, if you had open calls, if you had fair procedures and transparent and open, then you might be against corruption. But if you put people in a position where they have to be against corruption, but they don't see another way to succeed in life, if they're living in a society where that cannot be a privileged position of just working hard and getting educated, then you have a problem much bigger than legislation and mechanisms that you have to put in place.
Okay, who'd like to go? Oh, Jacek?
I will just only two very short things. Level of intolerance towards corruption in Iceland dramatically increased after the crisis, right? When it was discovered that half of its economy was based on the laundered money, and they had to bail it out with the public money. So it's not the best of the examples. I mean, it was learned hard way. It was learned hard way through the own pockets of ordinary people in recent decades, right? And as a matter of, and you're absolutely right, ordinary people understand it much better through the social life. But what drives me absolutely crazy is that establishment indeed are rubber stamping each other's reports on anti-corruption while people have to survive, like giving bribes here and there. And when you go to the website of international organizations which just did research of Croatia, how it implements anti-corruption measures, you will find that everything is fine with your country. That is hypocrisy. That should be fixed, because they're just giving each other like little awards for best anti-corruption practices while people have to survive. That is where we need to change something, because that is breeding populism, because people see it and say like, oh, our government just got an award for anti-corruption. Isn't it brilliant? And I have to pay bribe tomorrow. I mean, this is where this public cynicism is very close to go in just to vote in protest for whoever is not received award for anti-corruption.
Yeah, well, obviously everyone speaks from their own experience, and our experience in Poland is that corruption has come down had come down a great deal, and it didn't stop the electoral base of our opponents from not only saying that we were corrupt, but deeply believing it, right? I think there was... Well, that's a good question. I don't want to be too partisan, but one of the things that happened was there was a big corruption scandal in the middle of the second post-communist government. They then lost the elections, and I think both parties that were then opposition parties, which are now the two main parties in conflict, were really played the anti-corruption card, and then I'm not quite sure why, but became internalized some of that, right? But that in a sense is not the key point. That I wanted to go back a few steps. This is going to sound terribly affected, but to go back a few steps to Pericles' funeral speech. And it's always in my mind. I think we should. I mean, I'm a conservative, sort of moderate Tory and I believe that society evolves slowly and not always necessarily in the right direction. And Pericles said, "We Athenians, one of our great positive characteristics is that we help our friends and we harm our enemies." And this was considered positive. And when he said, and he meant it not only in international politics, but also within the polity. You were expected to help your friends and harm your enemies. Now, you know, that was 2,500 years ago, and a lot of things have changed. But if you think about it, there isn't a state of non-corruption. There's a process of more and more things being considered unacceptable or corrupt that used to be the very fabric of society, right? If you take Georgian England, or especially early Georgian England, the kind of politics that there's J.H. Plum, a famous wonderful history of the first 4 Georges. The sort of things that people said about each other and the sort of corruption that existed then is exactly the kind of stuff that you have in Russia, Kosovo, and wherever it might, and Bosnia, right? So it's a process, and a friend of mine said, 30 years, Radek Sikorski said, 30-odd years ago we were part of Eastern Europe, then we became part of Central Europe, now we would like to be part of Northern Europe, right? And this is part of that process, and then as you become part of Northern Europe, then, dinners at government expense might become unacceptable. But I'm not talking about nodding for billions, right? I'm talking about about things of that kind. Now, and it goes at different paces in different countries. And I think we should distinguish that, and I'm going to finish on this. I think we should distinguish that from an issue which is sometimes associated with corruption or nepotism or using government money for relatively small things that maybe you shouldn't, and taking things and the link between money and power and money and politics. Because quite frankly, the point that was made earlier about people not worrying about very high amounts of money that are earned in ways that they think are okay, the problem is that an extreme inequality of income in terms of people living a lot better than other people doesn't worry me too much. But an extreme inequality of income that leads to some people having massively more political influence worries me a great deal. And quite frankly, I'm not sure I care too much. It's obviously worse if they got the money illegally or corruptly, but I'm not sure I'm entirely happy if they got it totally legally, right? So these are, in a sense, at least intellectually, 2 theoretically separable problems. And one final thing I didn't say before, and I'd like to say now, because it's not related to corruption, but it's related to populism, is that with this anti-populist mobilization, I think, and it's implicit in what I said throughout the talk, but I think that this division between populists and anti-populists is going to last for a couple of decades. There'll be an anti-populist wave, it will have some successes, but then there'll be and it'll go back and forth for quite a long time. Thank you.
It's a subject that I think we could explore, because the results of the last American elections, the result of Brexit referendum, do show this actually pretty stark and clear divide between the cosmopolitan world and the provincial world, and including the industrial provincial world. But now, Francis O'Donnell, and I'm going to go 3 at a time, because otherwise I won't be able to keep up.
Thank you very much. Maybe I could just pick up and segue a little bit on the last few comments and mention, first of all, that I think it was the Corruption Perceptions Index last year, which very, very well made the point that very few governments at all were following through on the UN Anti-Corruption Convention, and that much, much more needs to be done. Now, when it comes to corruption, we've been talking, I think, a little bit about personal corruption, political and others. I'd like to look a little bit at the corporate side and come back to what Fredrik Erixon said earlier about market concentration. The Obama White House Council of Economic Advisors in April of 2016 came up with a very interesting report on the benefits of competition, where they went right into this issue of market concentration. The notion that there are some companies, the big fish eating the small fish, until eventually there's only one fish in the pond. And the extent to which that, in fact, can be very corrupting, engaging in regulatory capture, perhaps even state capture, but certainly not good for democracy, and certainly not in the area of media. When you have the media market dominated by 1 or 2 players, whether it's Berlusconi in India or Rupert Murdoch or Dennis O'Brien in Ireland, it is just not good for democracy, and I think we've seen the results of that. What comments would you have on that? And do we need to go a step further towards recognizing the special role economically, socially, and politically that very large global corporations play in the world today? There is still only 2 normative frameworks, and they're both voluntary. The UN Secretary General's Global Compact and the OECD principles. Do we need an international treaty on multinational corporations the do's and don'ts, the rights and obligations.
Okay, I'm going to take, so keep that one in mind. Just behind, who was it? Both of you?
Shumanov Ilya from one of the NGO from Russia. I would like to ask the Western colleagues, not Elena Panfilova. I would like to follow up the topic about the hypocrisy. We're speaking about the values when we speak about corruption, and every comment leads to the very fruitful discussion. But I would like to be shorter and to ask you about the global sanction programs that go from the United Kingdom, the European Union, and the United States. The sanctions imposed on the oligarchs, Russian, kleptocracy, Chinese, and other, or to the cronies of the corrupt officials or to the corrupt officials. But the sanctions now imposed on the facilitators, the Western enablers, who really facilitate to funneling money to the Western financing sector. And could you explain why? Thank you.
Okay, and then gentleman just behind you, you're the next one I saw.
Павел Викнянский, я представляю Украину, Всеукраинское общественное движение «Студ Республика», Киев, и такой момент.
And this is a point, this gentleman from Kiev, it's well that you touched upon multinationals. The thing is that recently my partner and I, we held an interesting survey where we counted all the transactions that go through the customs on exports of metals, metallurgy from Ukraine, and then we extrapolated it on steel and agriculture, and it turned out that on 3 spheres of Ukrainian economy alone, every year they just take out about 5 million euro in tax alone, which is equal to the macrofinance aid of the EU countries to Ukraine every year. And they mostly take up this money through transfers, pricing. And so to say, in not such poor countries, like Ukraine is now worst in terms of living standards in Europe ratings, but the money goes mostly to such countries that are not so poor, such as Switzerland and Luxembourg. So I suppose the question is not so much about international rules to fight corruption, but it has to do with more space for civil society. I know that Transparency International, where I think human rights activists have to come together. Do you think it's feasible? Could we overcome this ulcer of capitalism? Do we only need investigators of all countries unite together? But we, civil actors, we somewhere in Ukraine, another group in Russia, yet another in Luxembourg, in rich countries, we support one another. And if our oligarchs and mafiosi, let's put it bluntly, steal public money and funnel it out to the West, we've got some other people, like-minded people, who can help us defend our interests. Because if we have to speak about universalism, it's not so much universalism of money, it's rather universalism of integrity and honesty.
Yeah, I'll be quick. When I led civil movement Chester, we tended to reach out. Me? Andrei Kurglashov, Ukraine. We tried to help to get rid of many politicians which were perceived as not fit for their chair, both as members of parliament and as local councillors. And one idea was to discuss with people why at all they need MP or local councillor. And we said, you dislike politicians just because you don't know how to use them right. And often I found that politicians often do corruption because they don't know other ways to do things. It's a tool of governance, one of the key ways to get things done. And sure, people perceive corrupt but effective politician as a better one than uncorrupt and ineffective. But from your perspective of Europe or maybe other countries, what are the current trends in perception of representation? Why people in your countries perceive MPs as effective, like local representatives, because pork barrel is an issue almost everywhere, but it seems to be a socially accepted institution in the places where there is a single mandate system of elected representatives. But maybe there are more meanings how to be a good politician in parliament, but not be corrupt, but have a decent political career and have a living. What are those ways, and are they as images in the mind of society, or it's just you elect someone to hate and blame him?
Okay, we've got 4 questions and 3 panelists. Let me just answer with one thought about British politics in this case. There was a huge scandal about 3 years ago in British politics about the expenses claimed by members of the British House of Commons. It was actually pretty small stuff. I mean, it was silly stuff. They were claiming for 2 houses when they were only not living there or whatever. And yet it was more damaging to the image of the political class than perhaps almost anything else in recent years. And as a result of which, I think it was indeed another element of this backlash against the perceived political elite, the idea that they're all in it for themselves, even if it was the sort of dinner party level of corruption rather than the bloody great kickback on a project. Now, who's going to go first? Eric, what would you like to answer? Don't try and answer them all.
No, I'm not going to try that. I mean, first of all, I think it was very good questions and very good comments. I think I'll start sort of on the last question about on representation, where I'm just going to say sort of that Western politics, I mean, at least European politics, have for a long time, of course, been dominated by political parties that also were member-driven organizations. Sort of members played a role in these organizations. There were pretty many members in these organizations. And whether they were sort of on the center-left or on the center-right, there were typically sort of movement type of parties that could sort of reasonably claim to not just represent voters through elections, but they were also representing members. What has happened over the past 20 years is, of course, that it's been a radical decline in party membership. There's been a radical decline in the number of people who actually are prepared to accept sort of the conditions that exist if you want to make a political career through a party, leading, and I think this is a universal problem in Europe, leading to a situation where there is almost a declining degree of competition between those who actually wants to get into elected office, where the type of politicians that we elect these days in sort of these party mechanisms, they tend to be, I'd say, less and less impressive in terms of either their sort of intellectual qualities or in the qualities to actually be people who are willing to be strongly connected to voters, to meet voters, to talk to voters, and do it in a way where they sort of it's sort of easy for people to understand what they're saying. So we're getting more types of politicians that are neither sort of good at persuading voters and meeting voters, or politicians that you want to entrust a lot of power if they sit in government. A final issue I'm going to take on market concentration and the discussion that you started, which I think is a very good one. I've written a book about this and why I think growing levels of market concentration is a problem. The guy who led the work in the Obama White House, Tim Wu, has another great book out just now called The Curse of Bigness.
It's not as good.
No, it's not as good, but it's. I'm still going to plug it for him because he's a good friend. So, no, it's a really good book. Nepotism and corruption. What I think here is, I have some problems with these international organizations that are going to be forum for companies to come together and talk establishing principles, partly because those companies that tend to show up, whether it's UN Global Compact or other forums, tend to be exactly the problem, and they don't really want to talk about sort of fixing things in a real way. I have great problems with these type of companies that say they're doing things and they're hiring sort of swathes of compliance officers and many others that are there in order to keep executives rather in check. I mean, if I'm really want to sort of be of a suspicious mind and easily sort of select the companies where I think most fishy things are going on, I'll go to the companies that have employed most compliance officers, because they are probably the ones that are trying to hide something. So I think sort of many of these things are not going to be able to sort out by agreements or conventions where we establish a number sort of private rules of the game. I think it's much more about making sure that you take down the power that many of these companies have, that you stop them from actually getting bigger and exercising even more power they have today. And at the same time, as you make it easier for many others to step in and compete with them. And I mean, the point of capitalist competition should be that you aim sort of to step in and make sure that whoever is the big company there right now, that company should be made history. I mean, that's the sort of spirit that should guide it in. And if that's impossible, then that's what we have to fix.
Oh, thank you.
What about the one on civil society getting together?
Actually, Ilya asked me not to answer his question, but I'm going to. No, because I think that when you talk about no sanctions against facilitators, just check which country are voting against those sanctions, and consequently check the list of donors.
Who are the best? Do you think?
Who are the worst, you mean?
I mean the ones who crack down on corruption.
No, like Austria is blocking, Switzerland is blocking. I mean, usual suspects, check their donors of the ruling elites. And the question is easy. Who is stopping facilitators to be included in the sanction lists? I mean, it's like 2 + 2. It's just backing them, which leads me to the question like, yeah, you can have the best compliance office in the world. You can write the best compliance code, like the most elaborated compliance code. You have ethics department bigger than universe. But then you have GR department, which are working with the suitcases of cash towards the ministries, right? GR departments became like cover up for corruption, and nobody's hiding that. It's like it's like hypocrisy within hypocrisy. I mean, they sometimes even sitting at the same floor. Like that was the case with 10 KBP in Russia in former days. Like there was a compliance, perfect compliance under Matthew Murray. And on the other side, the absolutely corrupt GR department in the same building. I mean, and that is hypocrisy. And when we come to the monopolism, I mean, right, coming from the country with Rosneft, it's difficult to say anything about that. But I'm going to say that there is one thing which actually can work, like this reputation towards customers and reputation towards the voters versus reputation towards your peers. It's absolutely interesting thing that it's very trendy to take and give bribe when you are among those peers who do the same things, but you cannot sell that to your voters, right? So you have to have like double identity, very good guy towards your voters and kind of mingling around with people who are practicing revolving doors and conflict of interest. You should have different watch, different suitcase, different behavior, right? So, because it's very difficult to sell that image. And that, I think, answer to where it is going to go. People are, it's impossible to keep double identity, even though we know several very prominent politicians right now with double identity. And I'm going to finish up with agreeing with Jacek strongly. When I saw, strongly, because when I saw Mr. Orban in Hungary issuing all possible insane things against migration, but same Hungarian people welcoming people with soup, I got absolute trust that it's going to be on the side of civil society to figure out how to deal with those guys, sooner or later. And it'd rather be sooner than later. Thank you.
A couple of things that haven't been said, and then a couple of things that have been said, and I'll be contrarian, as they say, on the second ones. One thing that hasn't been said earlier is, well, has been raised as a question, but hasn't been discussed a lot, is the problem of the media. And the Polish case is really interesting, because Law and Justice came in, took over the public media totally, immediately at the beginning of their government, and turned the public media into an unapologetic propaganda machine for the ruling party. Now they're proceeding and trying to pick off private media by putting them under pressure and getting their friends who are rich in some way, one way or another, or else financed by state banks, for example, to take over independent private media and make them pro-government. But we also know that there's no shortage of rich, truly independent people who will direct their media towards being pro-populist. So, you know, if you look at Fox News, right, it's obviously created a certain kind of political culture itself, or Breitbart has created an even, a more rabid political culture. There hasn't been any breaking of rules here at all, right? It's not, but I can tell you that trying to ensure that there's some kind of neutral, unbiased public news service is not necessarily going to work because that's quite easy to take over. So while I agree that, for a properly functioning democracy, you need a variety of sources, it's far from easy to see how you can guarantee it, because either you accept private property, in which case the Foxes and the Breitbarts, what can you do about that, right? It's perfectly okay. If you try to do it the public route, you risk a takeover, right? Maybe not in the United Kingdom, but certainly in other places. Do you want me to stop there?
I think, okay, thanks, Jacek. I'll get in two more questions.
Thank you, Anton Barbish in Vilnius. I actually have a short question to Mr. Rostowski. As much as I would like a simple explanation that it was just a few angry Polish men who voted populists in power, I think there are a little bit more sort of subtlety to the question. If you look at those people who voted for peace, you have a clear-cut sort of separation between big cities and rural areas who actually voted. You have the separation between the east of the country and the west of the country. You have the issue of 20-30% of the lower kind of income Poles who felt disfranchised with the European integration, did not necessarily understood the very benefits that it brought, and sort of the economic inequality also kind of played a tremendous role. That's why it was a bit unclear why you've mentioned that as not being that important. So part of the message that the Law and Justice Party had with their, of course, populist agenda was addressing some of the issues that the previous government would not necessarily addressing in the fuller way. So in a sense, I think by saying that it is just the people that got mad and angry and that's why they're voting populists, we're sort of denying ourselves the necessity to look at the issues of the liberal agenda that was present and the time. And I think it is applicable to the United States as it is to Poland and many other nations. So the question is, what does the liberals in today's Poland have to do about themselves in order to fix the problems they had with their messaging to the Poles that voted populists? Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I'll take one more. Yes, the lady there at the back. You haven't done enough.
Thank you very much. Elira from Albania, a fellow at the McCain Institute in Washington, D.C. Thank you very much for being so open about the whole thing with corruption. I think in my country, in our region, is a word that we unfortunately know very well. And we know what we talk about. It comes with propaganda to cover it. And recently, in my country at least, it also comes in the form of public-private partnership, where the government gives money to wealthy companies owned usually by politicians. And they say, it's okay because the West still accepts us. And my question is, why? Why can't Brussels, Strasbourg, Berlin just say no to tapping the shoulders of our corrupt politicians? Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Jacek, you go first.
Okay, well, I mean, your facts are wrong. But first of all, let me take a step back. Obviously, it wasn't a few angry men because they won the election. In fact, they won the election by giving the impression that they were far more moderate than they turned out to be. So it wasn't even that angry. When I talk about anger, I'm talking about the present situation. And in general, I would say that you have something like, of the people who vote, a populist base of about 30% who are strongly populist, an anti-populist base of about 30% who are strongly anti-populist, and about 60% in the middle, out of the people who actually vote, not out of the electorate. On inequality, inequality in Poland actually fell throughout our government. Corruption fell quite sharply, I think, on the perception index, which is obviously only a perception index, from 58th place to 32nd place. So, you know, it's natural to lose elections. The problem isn't that you lose an election. The problem is when the people who win the election then start breaking the constitution. That's the problem, right? So, I don't see any problem with losing elections. That's entirely
you
natural.
remind me of Grigory Yavlinsky, who once said, democracy is about losing elections.
Democracy,
he knew quite a lot
democracy is about losing elections. The problem is that, you know, it's a different order of problems, since we're talking about Poland, when you have people who won 38% of the vote, have an absolute majority in parliament, but are way away from a constitutional 2/3 majority and are just ignoring the constitution, right? So that's really the problem. It doesn't make populists, you know, populists who just win the elections and then stay within the framework of the democratic order. I'm not even quite sure why you would define them as populists. Orban is an exceptional case where because of the opposition is utterly split, he's been able to get a constitutional majority with under 50% of the vote, right? So that's an exceptional thing. So therefore I refuse to answer your question about what should liberals do, right? What liberals should do, given when you have this kind of really dangerous populism, is fight it. And the way you fight it is by using many of the same tricks that the populists use. Unfortunately, the electorate mobilizes itself in that way. And then the other thing is, when you win, show no mercy. Now, moving on just very, very briefly to two other things which I think are more important. The first one relates to the point I made earlier about, you know, lack of corruption is not something you can arrive at, it's something you move towards, right? And one example of this was the point you made about the expenses scandal. An order of that kind of impropriety would actually, in Poland, have been unthinkable. So it's not an East-West division, right? It depends on each society. The other thing is, and just two things which I think might tie it up, and maybe the most important one, size matters. The amount of the corruption really matters. You know, the impropriety of the expenses scandal may have been distasteful, but it doesn't change the political system, all right? In a way, do we really want to get rid of all interpersonal relations in everything we do? One of our speakers, our first speaker, actually said that he was going to recommend a book because it was written by a friend of his. I'm delighted he did, but it immediately rang a bell for me. And I was in Sicily this summer, and I noticed something very interesting. Sicily is obviously known as being enormously corrupt. But apart from the corruption, there's also a sort of personalism, and you see it in bureaucratic offices. But paradoxically and interestingly, you also see it on the road. Nobody really cares too much about the traffic rules. But if you want to do something and pass somebody in a way that doesn't apply, isn't according to the rules, all you really have to do, if they're coming towards you, is look them in the eye, smile at them, and they'll let you do it. Well, if you try to do something that's according to the rules, but you don't look them in the eye and you don't smile at them, they won't let you do it, and they'll hoot at you and so on. And my question is, you know, if we're getting down to that level of removing the personal from our social lives, do we really all want to be Swedes? Thank you.
Elena, last thought, very quick. 20 seconds.
In fact, we do.
We do all want to be Swedes.
Yeah, no, we do want to remove that because you never know which second time will kill somebody. I mean, you never know. I mean, no, it's not yeah. No, it's never like, it's your gambling. It's permanent Russian roller coaster. It's permanent thing like, okay, this time he will do it, next time it's my enemy. And yeah, and at the moment you put there this unpredictability of personal connection, and tomorrow it changes, it can become a problem. Even though I absolutely agree with you that size matters, but also response matters, right? Responsibility of the system matters. And this is extremely important because there was a question like civil society, can civil society do something? We should unite. You know what the problem is? We, civil society, we don't have any right to put people in prison. We still have to go to police, and police, chief of the police is appointed by the newly elected political party. So we do need to work together. Politicians, media, business, again, politicians, and all in order to put it together, because civil society, as much as we want to be united, will never be able to put people in jail. Okay. Even though we know whom. Sorry.
Elena, thank you very much. Fredrik, I'm going to give you the last word, but I'm already 10 minutes over, and I've been told I won't get my dinner if I allow it to go on any longer.
Well, just very quickly then, I mean, I think sort of there's a worse offense than suggesting that sort of in the best of world you can end up being a Swede. And for Swedes, that is, you can actually become a Norwegian. But
I think he was thinking of Gustavus Adolphus.
Ah, okay, all right. Oh, indeed, yes, indeed. But I'll end on one point about sort of one of the benefits of being a Swede. So this is from the 1990s. I was then a researcher, and I was in Kenya interviewing politicians for a research project that I was involved in. And I had a meeting with one of the ministers who had been appointed the new anti-corruption Tsar in Kenya. His name was Nicholas Biwott. And when I entered his office, the first thing I was asked was, how much money I was willing to pay. And I said, so for what? And they said, well, you know, he could give you better answers if you if you pay. And I said, no, I'm not going to pay. But I had to pay. But one of the things of the good things of being in Sweden is that I actually managed to get a receipt from it.
I love it. He actually had a sticky end, Nicholas Biwott, I think. Look, thank you all very much to the panel for a great panel, and thank you to the audience. And I'm sorry I went over.